a strong influence on your thought. Could you speak to that?
Absolutely.
Being a native daughter of North Carolina, as well as a diaspora daughter.
Well, I mean, it's not only her biographies is inspirational, but one of the things about Anna Julia Cooper, in my book, Intro to Africana Philosophy, I have a section where I talk about the foundations of Africana thought. And I argue that Africana thought is a modern form of thought precisely because the African diaspora is an emergence from modernity. So if you study this area of work, you actually have a rigorous, a really radical questioning of what the human is in modern terms. Anna Julia Cooper did that. Among the things she did was not only interrogate the question of what it means to be Christian, what it means to be woman, but she also interrogated the very conditions by which we deal with the concept of value. If you look in her work, for instance, she pointed out that, you know that argument she makes about how what is invested in the individual will make a difference in terms of understanding the level of value that comes out. And so for her, a lot of enslaved people, a lot of black people, really were actually giving more than was invested in a lot of us. Now, in terms of her work, she also took it to the level of how one looks at language. And this is an important category in terms of a lot of the philosophical work. One of the things she pointed out, there's a great essay she has, for instance, in her response to when Paul Robeson played Othello. I don't know if many of you have read this essay. The director wanted Paul Robeson, because he was the first black actor to play a black man in a Shakespeare play, he wanted him to be supposedly authentic. So he wanted him to say, "I is." Now, and Anna Julia Cooper brought this out in her study for linguistics. No black person says "I is." "I is that Negro study stuff. You'll hear black people say "I'm a," which is a version of "I am." I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, and she brings this out. But she brings out something that's phenomenologically interesting. Because if a false construction of what you are to be as authentic is unleashed in the public, then many black people cannot begin to imitate what they think is authentic when that was never black to begin with. So she begins to show the force of ideological imposition. There are other things with her, in terms of, for instance, her philosophy of education. Because, for instance, she understood what it is to have a humanistic education. You know, one of the things that's happening in the academy right now is we're seeing in the act of privatization also an act of dehumanization of the university. And one of the things about a university, universities actually came out of an interrogation of what it is to be human. In fact, the word school is from the Greek word skole, which means leisure time. And the argument was that with leisure time, you can devote to uniquely human things. So the university was supposed to be the construction, the relationship of the building of human relations. In a way then, if you're to attack the humanities and social sciences in universities, you will in effect be de-schooling universities, de-universalizing them. Now, Anna Julia Cooper understood this in her conflict with Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee machine, which got very nasty. But one of the things that she understood very well was that the project of education, because she was in the practice of educating not only African Americans, but also Native Americans, was that the task of it is to bring the resources through which to interrogate the very question of what it is to be a human being. So she understood the philosophical anthropological question, not only in terms of her theological writings, but also in her philosophical writings on ethics and on politics. I mean, that's just some of it. There's a lot more. But, yeah. Yes, what's your name?
Tony Perry.
Hi, Tony.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was helpful to me in several ways. But I'm wondering, I do some work on James Baldwin, and in his Notes of the Native Summits, either in the 1984 preface or the introduction, he explains, or he argues that in the transportation of black peoples from Africa to the United States, like that dislocation, that in that the very cultural history of black people was fractured. And then that distance, that fracturing of cultural history in locating home, it complicates that process, and you point out at the end of your talk how crucial locating home is. And so what Baldwin argues is that the only accessible history that Black Americans ultimately have begins in America. As a means of orienting ourselves in the present, we can really only go back to the point where we arrive and access these historical narratives that give us meaning and value and orientation in the present. And so with this kind of claiming of America, he also seeks to claim citizenship in the West at large, because the history of America is very much tied to the history of Western civilization. And I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that concept, or if you could speak more to this concept of home and how it relates to Black Americans, being that it's something that necessarily must be problematized, but it's a very complicated process of locating this space, being that there's various dimensions of Blackness, and that Blackness itself is something that is contested.
Okay. Okay, to begin, well, there's several things, right? One of the things that I've argued in my writings, not in this lecture, but in my writings, is that the category African diasporic really emerges during the period of Andalusia. It's not actually through the Atlantic slave trade. And the reason is a complicated one, but a short version is with the emergence of the Islamic empires. Islam in North Africa worked its way up, all the way up to southern France. And at the time, there was no Europe, there wasn't a formation of Africa, or any of those. There was Christendom, and there was Islam, and somewhere in there, more connected to the Moors, were Jews, right? And what happened, a lot of us don't understand, is that this period was a period of 800 years. And so if you look at, for instance, African Americans with just, 500 years, of the impact that can have, imagine 800 years. It means the people who came in to Christendom are going to be a little different 800 years later. And the Christians who were there before are going to be very different. Now, you notice I haven't said race yet, right? I just put it in those terms because that was a world of theological naturalism. And so for them, what you were in your physicality was connected through an emanation from God. Now, in 1492, some significant things happened. And by 1492, there were certain concepts at work. Among them was the term raza. Raza, from which we get race, originally meant Moors, Jews, and breeds of dogs and horses. But the point about raza was originally raza was used because the Moors and Jews were considered foreign coming in. But when it was time to push them out, raza then shifted to mean those who are outside, you see? And so, as outside of Christendom, the theological naturalism led to a situation of whether in one's actual body, because the Jews and the Moors by this point were so mixed in with the more Germanic at the time Christians, that many of them look, well, it's hard to tell who was who. In fact, at this meeting, it's been very funny because I met some people who call themselves white. I'm like, yeah, you're white. Right? No, of course they're white, but what I mean it in that sense is there's a story, a history that's complex around the Mediterranean that goes back to this period of the Moors. And what happens in this story is that this period led also to the Arabic slave trade. And the thing about the Muslim world is the Muslim world reached the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. And so once you're beginning to create a situation, and then you also have within it a more complex form of enslavement, because many of the Africans, we forget that North Africans were, and still are, many are dark-skinned people, were becoming Muslim. And the complexity of how they became Muslim began a negotiation of an identity that began to raise the question of an African diaspora, okay? Well, that's an early period, but that's a crucial period, because once that begins to happen, you have an Africa now that's connected through the movement of empires, you see? However, in 1492, when the Moors were defeated, And when the Inquisition, by the March of that year, to deal with the question of negotiating the philosophical anthropology of who is properly Christian and who is not, by October of that year, Columbus landed in a new world. And that inaugurated a different anthropology because people were being met who were neither Christian, Jew, or Muslim. And this renegotiating led eventually to non-theological, over time, and more naturalistic arguments about how to construct the human. In the midst of that, as we know, Las Casas began to take seriously how this process was leading to the possible genocide of the native population. We know the story about how. But it means by the time you have now the transatlantic slave trade, there's already been a lot going on in Africa, because even independent of Muslims and Christians in Africa, Africa as a vast system of trade networks, not just slave trade, but other trade networks, meant there was a formed African, larger inter-African, so to speak, or inter-consciousness at work. This complex renegotiation took a form now, not only with the slave trade, but it also led to something very different. And the different thing it led to was threefold. The first thing was that this new emergence began to put behind Christendom, Islam, and bring to the forefront a new concept we call the West in Europe. So that means there's a symbiotic relationship between these events and the emergence of the West. The other thing that's complex in it is that if we go back into the story, there's a reason Jews are in the story. Because Jews are in the story as the meeting of the Judean eschatological world and the cyclical pagan world. And this fusion of pagan reason and eschatological faith created a concept called history. And so Western civilization began to emerge as a story of going somewhere, you see? And in that story, we now have this whole drama that begins to ask the question, what am I in terms of where am I going? Now, the home question becomes a very strange one precisely because in existential language, we're talking about people who are thrown, okay? In other words, we know there's a lineage in one sense to an Africa, but as we know, except for right now, it's being naturalized with genomic research to say which exact part, but it doesn't really answer that question. It shows where you're physiologically from, but it doesn't really deal with how you were existentially formed. The existentially formed self now, what's interesting about the question of home for the black subject is precisely because the structure of that world, because of that rejection I mentioned, means that the question of home becomes a constitutive one. You see? That's why you have so many black writers having this ambivalent relation to the past. Because, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm riveted.
If you could make it a little bit shorter.
So the very short response then is basically what anchors us to the past is going to be an understanding of what it is to be in the narrative of overcoming the enslavement to build a constitutive, better future. And so what it is I argue that what we are here is the project of the Constitution of Home.
Okay, one last very short question.
Very short
Just
question.
a very short
answer.
A very short question to a very short answer. I wanted to ask if there is any possibility to decipher this linkage or not linkage between desire and reason. We know that desire and reason are two terms that exclude each other. It's like the possibility in the impossibility, or the literature of disaster, as Maurice Blanchot would say.
Well, the short answer is they don't necessarily have to be separated.
Why do we use them then?
No, they don't necessarily have to be, but the thing is that the way I'm articulating reason is that reason is always an open concept, precisely because it has to be metastructural. Because it's self-evaluating, it finds that it has a breakdown of certain terms, which means that it can spread into the category of affect. That's a short answer. Right. In other words, affect and reason is actually, that can actually work. But the question of desire also is teleological. And one of the things I didn't get to talk about because it's a long talk, but when I do talk about disciplinary decadence and those things, I talk about why we need to have a teleological element in that's not a closed teleology. Right? In other words, what it is to have purpose without purpose being structured is closed. But that's a longer discussion.